5 mana 2/2s tend to be pretty bad. They frequently show up in my worst MTG top 10s. They're bad because 5 mana is a sizable investment that should give you a creature that, matters, but most 5 mana 2/2s just don't. They're bad at attacking, bad at blocking, and die to lots of 1 mana removal spells. You just can't spend that much mana for a card that has such a small impact on the board. In fact, 5 mana 2/2 is probably one of the worst stat lines in the game, at least when it comes to stat lines that have 50 or more cards out there. However, that doesn't mean that all 5 mana 2/2s are bad. After all, there are 112 of them, and they managed to design a few of them that do enough to be worthwhile. In this video, we'll look at the top 10 5 mana 2/2s in Magic, and it's an interesting study in what exactly it takes for a 5 mana 2/2 to actually be good. This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. Use the links in the description to visit their store. Before we get started, here's a quick reminder on how I rank cards in these videos. A first tier top 8 is worth 2 points. This includes events like Pro Tours, and a second tier top 8 is worth 1 point. This includes events like Regional Championships. At number 10, it's Cloud Blazer. For 3 generic, a white, and a blue, it comes with flying, and when it enters, you gain 2 life and draw 2 cards. One of the most common ways to make it so a 5 mana 2/2 is actually worth playing is to give it a powerful enters trigger. That's the case for most of the cards on this list, including Cloud Blazer. When a card has a good enters trigger, it doesn't really matter too much that your creature can easily die. I mean, just getting a chump block out of Cloud Blazer feels pretty good after you get a trigger that gives you 2 cards up front and gains you some life, to make it more likely you find the time to use those cards. Cloud Blazer's points all came in standard between 2016 and 2017, where it was played in some versions of the Copycat deck, which had a combo win condition where you could use Saheeli Rai and Felidar Guardian for a game-winning combo. You would use Saheeli Rai's -2 to make a token copy of the Guardian, which then blinks Saheeli Rai, and that resets to Planeswalker, so you can use the -2 again, and so on and so forth. However, when you couldn't get the combo going, Saheeli Rai and the Guardian were both also really good with Cloud Blazer because they could let you rebuy that powerful trigger. The Guardian eventually got banned because of the combo, and after that, Cloud Blazer still saw a bit of play in the format, generally in Oketra's Monument decks. The Monument making the Blazer cheaper was pretty sweet, but it doesn't have any points since 2017. At number 9, it's Biogenic Ooze. For 3 generic and 2 green, it makes a 2/2 when it enters, and at the beginning of your end step, it puts a +1/+1 counter on each of your oozes, and you can pay 1 generic and 3 green to make a 2/2 ooze. So this is a 5 mana 2/2 that not only makes an extra body, it also buffs itself and the token it makes, and can make even more tokens. This is definitely a 5 mana 2/2 that feels worth the mana, because the baseline here is usually 5 mana for 2 3/3s. Biogenic Ooze gained all of its points in Standard and Wilderness Reclamation decks. Those decks tended to have tons of mana lying around, and you usually needed instant speed stuff to really take advantage of the Reclamation's ability to double your mana, and Biogenic Ooze is a nice mana sink to have when your lands are constantly untapping. Wilderness Reclamation was eventually banned, which led to the Ooze losing a home in the format, and it doesn't have any top 8 since 2020. At number 8, it's Shard Phoenix. For 4 generic and a red, it's a flyer, and you can sacrifice it to deal 2 damage to each creature without flying. Given that it's a Phoenix, you also know that it doesn't stay dead. In this case, you can spend 3 red mana during your upkeep to return it to your hand if it's in your graveyard. While Shard Phoenix doesn't technically have an enters trigger, you can immediately sacrifice it to do 2 damage to all the creatures but flyers on the board, so it certainly impacts the board immediately, albeit by giving itself up. The fact you can keep recurring it and doing 2 to the board is a real pain for your opponent too, especially if they're trying to rely on smaller creatures. In Standard, it was played in Survival of the Fittest decks. These were toolbox decks that could use Survival to tutor up creatures ideal for a given situation, and Shard Phoenix was one of the creatures that you wanted to grab against aggressive opponents. It's also pretty nice that if you discard the Phoenix to Survival, you get to tutor up a card and you can still get the Phoenix back later. In Extended, it was played in Oath of Druids decks. This powerful enchantment lets you put the top creature for your library into play for free if you have fewer creatures than your opponent, and the Phoenix was one of the few creatures the deck ran. While it wasn't the deck's win condition, it was a creature you could get and sacrifice to eliminate threats, and the fact it left your board was a good thing because it made it easier for you to trigger Oath again on a later turn. After a core set reprint, it also saw play in Standard again in 2006, where it appeared in the sideboard of a burn deck, and it has a lone legacy point that came in the sideboard of an Imperial Recruiter deck. The Recruiter is another card that can tutor up the Phoenix when it's at its best. However, it doesn't have any top 8 since 2014. At number 7, it's Karmic Guide. For 3 generic and 2 white, it comes with flying and protection from black, and when it enters, it reanimates a creature from your graveyard. It also has Echo for 3 generic and 2 white, which means you have to pay that cost on your next upkeep or sacrifice the guide. Getting a 2/2 flyer while reanimating the best creature from your graveyard is pretty great, although Echo does usually mean you won't be holding onto that 2/2 into your next turn, but you still get lots of value here. While it was printed way back in 1999, it didn't put up its first top 8 until 2007, when it made its debut in one of the most broken decks of all time, the Legacy Flash Hulk deck. This deck emerged after Flash had its power level erratum removed, and it was returned to its original functionality. The whole game plan of these decks was to cast Flash and put Protean Hulk into play without paying the 2 generic mana, then it gets sacrificed and you get that powerful death trigger to search up 2 creatures, Karmic Guide and Carrion Feeder. The Karmic Guide reanimates your sacrificed Protean Hulk, and then you can sacrifice it again, this time to Carrion Feeder, and you get the death trigger all over again. This time you search up Kiki-Jiki Mirror Breaker, then you use Kiki-Jiki to make a copy of Karmic Guide, and you sacrifice Kiki to the feeder, then the guide reanimates Kiki-Jiki, and you are now in a loop that lets you make as many copies of Karmic Guide as you want, and then you can swing for lethal. This deck could win as early as turn 1 with fast mana and Legacy, so Flash got banned out of the format after a single event, and that meant Karmic Guide largely stopped seeing play in the format, although she has seen a little bit of play over the years. By the way, if you want an even deeper dive on Flash Hulk, I do have a whole video about that deck. More recently, Karmic Guide got reprinted in 2021's Modern Horizons 2, making it legal in Modern for the first time. It started to see some singleton play in the format, generally in toolbox decks that run Eladamri's Call, and could get the guide when there was a good target in your graveyard. However, the guide hasn't put up any top 8 since 2023. At number 6, it's Riftwing Cloudskate. For 3 generic and 2 blue, it's a flyer that bounces a permanent to its owner's hand when it enters. It also comes with Suspend 3 for 1 generic and a blue. This means you can pay that cost and exile it from your hand and then put 3 time counters on it. You remove one of those each upkeep, and when you remove the last one, you get to cast the Cloudskate without spending any mana, and it enters with haste. So the Cloudskate has an effect that impacts the board when it enters, and players often aren't spending 5 mana on this 2/2 to begin with. If you spend 2 mana to suspend it earlier, you usually get some amazing tempo the turn it comes into play, since it bounces a permanent and often smashes in for 2 in the air. In Block Constructed, it was played in blue-green aggro and control decks, and in Standard, it was played in more graveyard-oriented decks that used Makeshift Mannequin and Revelark. Those decks both treat their graveyard as a toolbox of sorts, with the intention of rebuying into the battlefield abilities, and the Cloudskate was a great thing to get back in situations where you really needed to bounce a permanent. It hasn't gained any points since rotating out of Standard, though. At number 5, it's Ave, Progenitor Ooze. For 2 generic and 3 green, it comes with Storm, which means when you cast it, you copy it for each spell cast before it that turn, and those copies become creature tokens. Eve tokens aren't legendary, and it enters the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter on it for each other ooze you control. So this is yet another 5 mana 2/2 that brings some friends along for the ride, and in this case, the creature usually isn't really a 2/2 to begin with, nor are all of its friends. So yeah, this can spit out multiple bodies that enter the battlefield as absolutely massive creatures, if your storm count was high enough. It's gained points in both Modern and Legacy Storm decks, usually in the sideboard. In Modern, Storm decks play Wish, which can grab Ave out of the sideboard once the storm count is high enough. In Legacy, most Storm decks try to win with Tendrils of Agony, but they can't do that if the opponent has given themselves Hexproof, a common strategy against them, so Ave is something you can bring in against opponents who you know are citing in that type of hate. Ave is going to continue to put up top 8s in Modern and Legacy, and it has a good chance at moving up the list. At number 4, it's Siege Gang Commander. For 3 generic and 2 red, you get 3 1/1 goblin tokens when it enters, and it has an activated ability that costs 1 generic and a red, and you sacrifice a goblin, and Siege Gang Commander does 2 damage to any target. This 5 mana 2/2 actually gives you 5/5 worth of stats spread across 3 bodies, and can turn your goblins into removal or direct damage. Unsurprisingly, the commander has been played in goblin decks in multiple formats over the years. If you have a commander in play and you get to untap, you're going to make life a nightmare for your opponent. One of the nastiest things you could do with Siege Gang Commander is to combine it with Goblin Sharpshooter. The sharpshooter can tap to ping things and it untaps when a creature dies. So your opponent can have quite a bit of life left, and if you have just a little bit of mana, goblins, and goblin sharpshooter in play, it's not that hard for you to finish them off. The commander has received a couple of reprints that gave it more time in Standard, first in 10th edition and then in Dominaria, and while there really wasn't a competitive goblin deck for it to be part of in Standard, after either of those reprints, he was still played in a lot of red decks. This includes more aggressive decks like Red Deck Wins and Rakdos Aggro, but it was also played in control sideboards as something to bring in the mirror match. Siege Gang Commander doesn't have any top 8 since 2019 though. At number 3, it's Acidic Slime, the third ooze to make the list. I hadn't really realized there were so many good 5-mana 2/2 oozes. Acidic Slime costs 3 generic and 2 green, and it comes with Death Touch, and when it enters, you destroy an artifact, enchantment, or land. So the slime can subtract from your opponent's board one way or another when it enters, and because it has Death Touch, your opponent will have a hard time taking this 5-mana 2/2 down without giving up another card. Acidic Slime gained most of its points in Standard, a format it had some extra time in thanks to 4 separate core set reprints. It's mostly been a sideboard card, one that could deal with dominant cards in various formats like Valakut Molten Pinnacle, Birthing Pod, and the various equipment played in Cobblade decks. It was also briefly played in modern Birthing Pod decks since it was a good thing to tutor up with the pod when it had a good target, like an opposing Birthing Pod, which was often the case when that deck was at its height in Modern. However, it's been more than 10 years since it last put up a top 8. It'll take another Standard legal reprint for it to ever gain more points. At number 2, it's Mole Drifter. For 4 generic and a blue, it's a flyer, and when it enters, you draw 2 cards. It also has Evoke for 2 generic and a blue, which is an alternate casting cost, and if you pay that instead, Mole Drifter gets sacrificed when it enters the battlefield. In other words, you're largely paying for the enters trigger when you evoke it. Sort of the original version of Cloudblazer, Mole Drifter has the potential to deliver a 3-for-1, and if you don't have the time to get all the way to 5 mana, you can still evoke it and get a 2-for-1. While Mole Drifter is good in a vacuum, it's usually been played in decks that can really abuse it by getting that enters trigger as much as possible. For example, in Standard it was played alongside Revelark, which we mentioned earlier, and in Modern and Pauper it's usually played in Ephemerate decks. That 1 mana instant has Rebound, so you can get 2 triggers for only 1 mana, which is pretty incredible on a creature like Mole Drifter. It's going to continue to put up top 8s in Pauper going forward. And at number 1, it's a card that I've already mentioned in this video, so it probably isn't very surprising. That's right, it's Kiki-Jiki Mirror Breaker. For 2 generic and 3 red, it comes with haste, and you can tap it to make a token copy of a non-legendary creature you control. The token has haste, and you sacrifice it at the beginning of the next end step. So, while this technically doesn't have an enters trigger, it does have haste and an activated ability, so it basically has one. Kiki-Jiki first found success in the same deck that Karmic Guide first found success in, Flash Hulk, and we already saw how that combo worked, but that's not the only combo deck that Kiki-Jiki has been part of. Its entire resume is combo decks. In Modern, it was played in Splinter Twin decks, while plan A for those decks was to use Splinter Twin on a Deceiver, Exarch, or Pestermite to win the game with 1,000,000 tokens by using the copies to untap the enchanted creature. Plan B was to use Kiki-Jiki in place of a Splinter Twin. Like Twin, he could allow you to make as many token copies as you wanted, since each copy you made of the Exarch or Pestermite could untap Kiki-Jiki. Kiki was also played in Birthing Pod decks, which ran several creature-based combos since it could search up whatever creatures it wanted. In those decks, the plan was Kiki plus Restoration Angel, which would also allow you to make 1,000,000 copies of a single creature. Eventually, Splinter Twin and Birthing Pod both got banned out of Modern, and that slowed Kiki down for a while. He was seeing a little bit of play in Toolbox decks that used Chord of Calling to assemble combos, but more recently, he started to be played in Goblin combo decks in Modern, Legacy, and Vintage. This is largely the result of the printing of Conspicuous Snoop. The Snoop gains the activated abilities of Goblins on top of your library, and that means if Kiki-Jiki's on top, which is easy to achieve thanks to Boggart Harbinger, the Snoop has access to that powerful ability often in the early game, and that means the Snoop can make token copies of itself, which also have that ability, not to mention haste, and you can do this as many times as you like. Then you can copy the Harbinger and put Sling Gang Lieutenant on top of your library, and sacrifice all of your goblins to win the game. Kiki-Jiki is in great position in Modern, Legacy, and Vintage right now, and it will probably only extend its lead in the future. So those are the best 5 mana 2/2s. If you want some powerful creatures that are great despite their stat line, check out the description, where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each card that appeared in this video. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to catch up on the over 800 other MTG top 10s, including more that look at creature stat lines, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. And if you want to catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. Thanks for watching.